Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. I'm with Ashley Colby, my pretty regular co-host here, and we have a very special guest today that both of us have been following for quite a while and have been influenced by Mr. Jim Rutt. Hi, Jim. How are you doing?
Hey, Jason. Hi, Ashley. Great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Great to have you. Where do we start? I've been following your work and the game B stuff, which we'll talk about what that is for at least 3 or 4 years so far. It's been very influential on my thinking. I love your podcast. I haven't listened to every single episode, but I've listened to many of your episodes, and it's great food for thought and for thinking in general. Why don't we start just a brief background? I think a lot of our audience will know who you are already, but just a brief background on who you are, where you came from, and what you're doing.
Righty. I was basically a business dude for about 25 years and started some companies, then became a corporate executive about halfway through my trajectory. And then around 2001 said, enough, chips are stacked high enough. Have a good day, Mr. Business People. People were shocked. It was at the very top of my career and had just pulled off a major business coup, and everybody wanted me to be their next CEO. And I just said, no, 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 no. And I then went back to my roots in science, initially as a independent researcher at my house. The day I retired, I walked down the hall to my well-equipped little digital lab and started writing evolutionary computation code to evolve game-playing agents through with evolutionary software. And somehow this got out, and a guy I know at the New York Times wrote a story about it, and the Santa Fe Institute saw that story, and president called me up and harangued me until I agreed to come out there and visit, and I did. And they made me an offer to come out there as a researcher, and for various family reasons, it worked out. And so I went out to the Santa Fe Institute as a very junior researcher, about the equivalent of a postdoc, and really had a great time there. And then I foolishly let them talk me into getting involved in the governance side of things. And so I was on the board, and then I was a vice chair, and then I was the chairman for a while, and helped move the institute from a rather catch as catch can, tin cup out all the time outfit to it's now pretty solid outfit, and runs real well, and all that sort of stuff. Had at least a little bit to do with that. And then in 2012, for family reasons, I stepped down from that, and we moved back to Virginia. And during that time, I met a very important colleague and collaborator who's really been indispensable in a lot of work I do. Though, of course, as always, all errors are mine, right? We always have to put that disclaimer in everything. That's Jordan Hall. I actually met him. He was a young trustee at the Santa Fe Institute. And after a board meeting, we often people just get together and chat. And he and I ended up in one of the lounges and started talking. I think we talked for about 6 hours, right? We turned out we were both seeing different parts of the elephant, right? But it was the same elephant. And the fundamental insight, and this was probably about 2009, was that be operating with honesty and good faith in the corporate world circa 2009 was a sucker's game, right? And that literally became the kind of the foundation of what later became the Game B movement. Is what the hell kind of society is it where operating with honesty and good faith is what fools do, right? That was just fundamentally repugnant to both of us, right? I think we were both unusually, because he was also a successful corporate CEO. Both of us were CEOs of publicly traded companies, so we had made our mark as game A motherfuckers, right? But we concluded that this was just had passed long ago any point where being efficient and operating well and being excellent had long since been left behind to chicanery, higher finance, money on money return had trumped every value that was out there, and that certainly was not the kind of world we wanted to leave for our kids and grandkids, right? And we started corresponding, and around 2012, I wrote 65-page paper called the Root Doc, as it became known as, or also known a little bit more mockingly, perhaps more accurately, as the Tome, right? that laid out all kinds of stuff. And I sent a copy to Jordan, and he sent a copy to Brett Weinstein, I think was the next person to read it. And then it kind of networked, and a group of people coalesced. And then in 2012, we actually did the first Stanton convening in Stanton, Virginia. I think 12 or 13 people got together, and we foolishly decided to start a political party. Of all the ways to try to change the world, what an idiotic one! And so we worked.
Worst.
Just terrible. But we worked on that for about 4 or 5 months. We actually launched a party called the Emancipation Party. And just for giggles, I keep paying the $10 a month or whatever it is to keep the website up. So cannot find it with Google, which is kind of handy. But if you know the URL, you can find it. emancipationparty.org.
Great.
And you can see our reforms and all this. We actually rolled it out, got a few hundred members to pay $20 a month, and all this. But that being good business people, we analyzed it. We went and did some market research and some polling, and we discovered the following: that it probably had enough pull with baby boomers to have, gotten to some significant size. Xers, it was maybe it was a close call. Boomers, they all hated it. Ew. And we determined that the reason was the concept of a political party had become so tarnished in the minds of boomers.
You mean millennials?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Millennials. Yeah. Boomers. Yeah. Kind of like the formulation. Yeah. Xers were kind of, maybe, like typical Xers, fuckers don't make their minds up about anything. And then millennials had very strong opinions. It sucks. Right. And we just, of course, being wise-ish, we said, well, the future depends on the millennials. So if the millennials don't like this, even though we could build it to have 1 million members probably and make a noise and all, but it will not change the future if it doesn't capture the young. And so then we reconvened, I guess, like our third Stanton meeting in Stanton in January 2013. Jordan Hall was just up at the whiteboard, as he often was, gesturing, doing things. He wrote 2 circles, A and B, and an arrow from A pointing to B, and saying, what we have to do is create a second game. Let's call it Game B, that pulls resources from A and builds B. Mm-hmm. And it kind of went on, but we didn't talk about all that much. And then between the third and the fourth meeting, a guy named Thor Muller, who had been involved from the very beginning, sent out a quite interesting email to everybody, at this point about 25 people, saying he believed that Game B should be the name of the new thing. And he even put together a hokey little logo, which is still a slightly cleaned up version, is still the Game B logo. And we all sort of said, hey, what the hell? Why not? Sounds good. And so that's sort of the origin story for how essentially conversation between Jordan and I turned into this tome, which then turned into 25 people, which by the end of June 2013, about 80 people. And that was sort of the origin of, the Game B idea, which was, how do we do radical social change without revolution, hopefully? And how do we do it in a way that appeals to young people and yet is able to become real and fully transform the social operating system of humanity in a reasonable period of time? And what reasonable period of time was, we didn't know. But I think subsequently I've come to think of 3 generations as a reasonable period of time. When you look at the history of attempts to radically transform society in lesser times, like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution or Pol Pot, generally speaking, a disaster to try to fundamentally change civilization in 1 generation. We're going to make a new person. Yeah. Generally turns out to be genocide or dictatorship or some horror of some sort. So anyway, that's sort of how we got to where we're at.
That's great. I'm wondering now, to get people to wrap their heads around practically, I know it's evolved a lot since the early days, and you had a lot of theoretical ideas, and then I think a lot of people were trying things in the real world and meat space, as they say. So what is the current state of various Game B experiments. I think you call them proto-Bs.
Yeah,
Maybe just to wrap our heads around, like, what are people actually doing? How are they running with this idea?
I'll back up just a little bit first, which is that an important doctrine of it's funny, the doctrine of no doctrines is that Game B does not have a catechism. There is no legal entity. Nobody holds the trademark. When people say they don't like Game B for this, that, or the other reasons, well, go build your own. God damn it! You know,
Yeah.
it's a cloud of ideas, and so different people express Game B-ness in different ways. And there have been, I can think of 3 or 4 companies, small ones, that were launched with explicit 4, 5, 6, maybe more than that now, Game B intent, which typically is around a more egalitarian style of management, more egalitarian style of ownership, not designing the company to maximize money on money return in the shortest possible fashion. And then you mentioned proto-Bs, which is an idea that I think became current in the Game B world around 2019 with the second coming of Game B, because we did go into hiatus for a number of years, which is interesting. But
that's when I caught on to it, is the second coming. Late 2019 is when I started seeing it, a bunch of people online talking about Game B, and I got interested. And that was also when I started listening to your podcast. So
and that's when I started my podcast.
I listened to it from the very beginning, so I was on board.
Boy, you need something more engaging in your life if you spend that much time listening to my podcast. But by the way, that's the Jim Rutt Show at jimruttshow.com. Got to get the old pitch in there. And so the idea of a proto-B, and I think we'll eventually get to the new theory, or at least the new theory that I am helping put together, and in consultation with all the other many of the other thinkers of Game B, is that before we do that, let me hop back to the interregnum, the period where Game B collapsed. In late 2013, we tore ourselves apart over a couple of issues. The principal one was personal change first versus building alternative institutions first.
Ooh, this is good. This is going to be very good. These insights for us, because you're the elder statesman. You've gone through this cycle with this group already, so we're going to need these insights for
and it got really vicious, and people got banned from the online community, and then just like the Mennonites, when somebody gets shunned, other people pull away too because they're their allies. Eventually it got to the point we just said, fuck this is just not working, and I officially declared it spore mode, which I think is at the end of 2013, early 2014. We've all created a lot of ideas here together. It isn't working, but we have come a long, long way. Consider where we started, in April 2012. So take what you have learned and go out into the world and do good work. And maybe someday the spores, we literally called it spore mode, just like the funguses give out spores, which can live in the ground for hundreds of years and then sprout. Go out and do something, and maybe Game B will sprout again. And so we did, and then so for a whole series of interesting contingencies, it sprouted back up again in 2018, I think, maybe late 2017, early 2018, and then just really caught fire and grew much faster. And a lot of us laughed at ourselves, actually, as we got back together again. How could we have been so stupid, right? Clearly there's an answer to this personal change first versus institutional change first. And the answer is you need both, right? Here's just a real simple example. Imagine you're the parent of a 9-year-old girl who just shows up at home after school and says, "Oh, my best friend just got a smartphone. Oh dear." What do, right? Do you cut your 9-year-old off from her friends by saying, "No, you can't have a smartphone"? Or do you give them a smartphone, knowing that a smartphone to a 9-year-old is probably worse than giving them a pack of cigarettes, right? It's a very difficult problem. But if you lived in a community or within a context where everybody agreed that giving a smartphone to a 9-year-old is like giving them a pack of cigarettes, the stress is not actually that difficult. So in that sense, the personal change, don't get sucked in so deeply into the social media thing at such an early age, which is a personal change thing at one level, is reinforced by the institutional decision the community norm, which is an institution in the language of an economist, at least. I don't know about a sociologist.
Yeah, sociologist, we would call that an institution.
Okay, yeah, okay, yeah, certainly the people. Yep. So, so we now, I think, all believe that the answer to the alleged conundrum is there is no conundrum, that it's a spiral, that it's very difficult for most people. And I think one of the reasons we miss this is that most of the founders were that 2% that are the anomaly. We don't really give a fuck what other people think, right? But most people are very, 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 very dependent on what other people think. And, it makes sense. We're a collective cooperative species. And most of us, most of these iconoclasts like us would have had a hard time out in the real world in forager times. So the normies, shall we say, need institutions to stabilize their personal change. And to build new institutions, we need people with new and different capacities. And so it's this very intricate dance of, introducing personal change, different perspectives, while building new institutions that not only stabilize the new changes, but essentially prepare the ground for the next level of personal changes. And from that perspective, came the idea of the proto-B, which was a concept of, all right, let's see if we can jumpstart this even further. Instead of trying to do it in communities that exist today with all the countervailing forces, such as the friend of your 9-year-old, maybe it's a better idea to create on-the-ground communities of people who have all collectively agreed on shared values and a shared way to live. And importantly, they have not necessarily all agreed on the same. Different communities could have different agreements. And we call that higher level perspective coherent pluralism, that we have some coherence of belief, relatively small core, but that the communities themselves can choose any mutually agreeable way to live. So that gets away from the problem of, again, we're all going to follow, Karl Marx, Das Kapital or something, right? Nope. If you want to have full on, hardcore, total egalitarian socialism, a la the early Israeli kibbutzes, fine. See if it works. You want to have kind of the Ayn Randian paradise over there? Okay, well, give it a try, see how that works, right? But talk to each other. And one of the other things about this was much the way bacteria operate, where there's lots of horizontal sharing of DNA. We would expect proto-Bs and any other game B entities to share what they're learning horizontally. So over time, this high dimensional search of design space probably converges to some relatively small number of patterns, but not necessarily one. And so going back to our knowledge of anthropology and sociology and network science, we proposed that probably a target size for a proto-B might be on the order of 150 people, the so-called Dunbar number. And I like that Dunbar number because it's been demonstrated through long human history. 95% of our history was before so-called civilization. That we could manage ourselves without any computers, without any fancy Robert's Rules of Order or anything else, in groups up to about 150. And Robin Dunbar explains this because he's interestingly both a anthropologist and an evolutionary psychologist, as that 150 is about the number of debits and credits that we can track in our brains without formal externalized systems. So, is Ashley a good person who gives more than she takes, and Jason's a bad person who takes more than he gives in a community of 150? He's going, yeah. No, just an example, folks. Hypothetical. That you can keep track of that in your brain, and that there are relatively easy ways for communities of 150 to govern themselves. And now there's some people who make arguments that maybe that's a little too big. And even indeed in some of the anthropological literature, there's also some sense that 50 is another core size. And then there's some other people who think, it's too small, 300 maybe. But somewhere in that range, 50 to 300, we've come to hypothesize, at least, is a good size for a self-governing community that should be able to and should take strong points of view about things. Do not see proto-Bs, a given proto-B, as for everybody, right? I sometimes use the example just because it's so polarizing. I could imagine a proto-B that absolutely forbids abortion, right? Or I could also imagine a proto-B that absolutely requires abortion. No children may be born, right? I would not like that second one at all, but within the logic of proto-B, that would be allowed. And so long as other core values are kept. And I think that's really important, totally different than most social change movements, which have one way to be. We say, look at human history. There are 6,000 ways to be, at least, if you look at the anthropological literature. Why do we think we should collapse to one way to be right now? Particularly because we don't, we're pretty unclear about what the future really brings. So why not take a evolutionary and network perspective and try different things? And as long as we keep talking to each other, probably there'll be convergence towards what works. Now, I will say that building proto-Bs turns out to be a pain in the ass, especially in the United States. The biggest problem, two. One, the obvious one's money, but even that's more solvable than the second one, which is land use regulation, building codes, health departments, etc.
Yeah.
The number of loops you have to hop through in most parts of the United States to, let's say, buy a 160-acre farm, which we think is a good size, probably for 150 people. Get it zoned so that you can put up 75 houses on it, that you can build the houses closely together in a village rather than having them sit out on 2-acre lots the way the zoning department thinks. And in one county where we actually were about ready to buy a piece of land, we discovered they had a zoning regulation that required minimum house size, 800 square feet. And we said, we see some of the housing for the digital nomads who might stay at a proto-B for a while before moving on, maybe on a 300 square foot range. And then, but with lots of communal space, communal food, etc. Oh, no, that's not allowed here in this county. You'd have to have a special exception. And what are the chances that we'd get a special exception? They said for 700 square foot, probably. For 300 square foot, no way, right? And so, I guess that project isn't going to work. Many, many, many obstacles. There have been two so far that I know of, quasi proto-Bs that have gotten launched. Neither of them, what I'd say, are full-fledged, full-on, well-financed, but they exist in the world. And there's probably 25 projects around the world, the people slowly trying to pull the money together, the plan together, and figure out a locality that would be hospitable to this kind of thing. And so that's sort of where that stands. So a lot of interest in it, but not as much action as I would have liked at this point. There also, I think, subsequently since then, we've realized that is kind of too all or nothing for most people, right? To leave your friends behind and move to some what sounds like hippie cult village out in the boonies does not appeal to everybody. And so, we now believe there has to be a ramp. And so I'm seeing a continuous, and this is where Doomer Optimism, I think Game B plugged together very nicely, is a ramp from the most minimal up to really strong forms of Game B-ness. And, for instance, example I use all the time, because we had a very successful one in the community I grew up in, was a babysitting cooperative, right? Everybody complains about how hard it is to find babysitters, right? Well, when my parents moved into this post-classic small post-World War II suburb, the mothers, most of whom were college dropouts, figured out how to get together and form a formal babysitting cooperative with a ledger book and the whole deal. Ledger book with pencil, people, right? Not that hard. And they figured it out. And it went on for years until some of the youngest girls got to be 12 or 13, and they could then take over the babysitting business. And so one could imagine that as a entry-level Game B thing. One could imagine a group of people, small group of people, 5 families coming together and forming a car co-op, for instance, where, do we really need 2.4 cars each? But every once in a while, it'd be handy to have a pickup truck. So, 5, 6, 7 families might own a pool of cars. Now, it turns out that's an interesting idea, and there's a lot of personal interest in it. But there's also a lot of barriers: legal, liability, insurance, governance. And so, those sorts of things need to be figured out by some group, and then those founding documents shared to lower the activation energy for other people to do the same things. And the same's true for Game B Ventures. I said a few of them have accidentally formed, not accidentally, they've been intentionally formed, but it would be very nice to have, more examples that are then reduced to actually reproducible practice. So people could say, here's a set of legal documents, here's some financing strategies that are considered to be generally considered to be Game B compatible, et cetera, and put those out there in the world, and then see more and more people doing this. And so that we can see a pattern of people engaging in increasing amounts of Game B in their life scattered, with perhaps at least short-term top of the food chain being some small percentage who choose to live in dedicated communities. So you say, what is the pattern that unifies all these theories so that, because if everything is Game B, then nothing is Game
Right.
B. Right? That's a classic problem. And this is where the book writing project we talked about in the pregame has been very, very helpful. My co-author does not take any of my shit. She makes me get very, very specific, which is great. And so between her and I, we have figured out that probably the thing that we can say definitively about all Game B entities is that their purpose is to take Game A resources and convert them to a commons. Now, it may not be that everything we take in is converted to a commons, but at least a part of what is processed across the membrane from A to B is converted from personal ownership to common ownership. And that may be, the one single distinction necessary. Think about the babysitting co-op. Instead of people being paid Game A dollars to do babysitting, we have a commons, which is our shared commitment to provide babysitting services to each other using a ledger system to keep everybody honest and to at least point out who the free riders are. But it's a community owned thing. It's not individually owned. It's not for profit per se. And I think we can use that as a very simple lens for what is Game B, which then led, or actually it was coming from a different direction, basically conversations Jordan Hall and I have been having for years, is that if we want to then think about that, how can you make that more specific? Every Game B thing is a membrane. There's a circle around something, and it could be the babysitting club, and it just covers this group of people in their relationship as babysitters, right? It could be a company, which is the people working in the company who are operating via Game B governance method and methods of finance and methods of ownership, et cetera. And then any membrane is, at least in the biological sense, is semi-permeable. What comes in, what goes out. And it turns out in the origin of life, which Jason probably knows, a listener to my podcast, is one of the things I'm highly fascinated with. I've had bunches of guests on that topic. It turns out that it was the existence of membranes, almost certainly, that was a precursor to the invention of life. And that if you don't have that membrane, things get diluted and broken up very easily. And this is my answer to why so many of the intentional communities failed, because they didn't have well-defined membranes, nor were they part of greater membranes that help stabilize them. And so when you say, what's a membrane? Well, let's say you have a babysitting club. Who gets to become a member of the babysitting club, right? If you have a defined membrane, a membership method, who you screen, and bring in people who meet your criteria and who agree to the common values of the organization. And guess what? What's another thing membranes do? They get rid of toxins out through the membrane. Let's say the biological metabolites, there's a fair number of toxins created, and the membranes have evolved to allow the toxic metabolites to exit the cell. So in your babysitting club, guess what? Occasionally you're going to find a toxic metabolite, and those persons need to exit the cell. And so we found this idea of membranes to be very fruitful. And in a more general form, I'm now seeing a system of membranes within membranes within membranes, right? That cover different things. So for instance, let's suppose Augusta County, Virginia had 5 proto-Bs, 10 babysitting clubs, 4 co-housing projects, and 9 Game B companies. They may well choose to form a Augusta County proto-B association, which did things like had a buying club and maybe a food exchange, etc. And maybe the proto-Bs themselves, just those, the 5 proto-Bs, had the Augusta County proto-B membrane, which had rules for things. It may also have had some services inside, kind of like the equivalent of mitochondria that provide services in the membrane. You watch these membranes kind of go up. You can have littler membranes inside of bigger membranes, but you can also have overlaps. You can have big regional geographic membranes, but then you could also have guild membranes. For instance, there could be companies and communities that are focused on, let's say, natural fiber-based clothing, right? Some of them growing natural fiber, some of them processing it into cloth, and some of the converting the cloth into clothing. And this whole food value chain could be encapsulated within a membrane that has rules on how we do business with each other. And then this is where it gets real interesting. In a membrane such as that, you could create a new currency, or in a more formal sense, you could create a protocol between the submembranes that are operating in this larger membrane to allow themselves to do business and establish mutual credit with each other without having to get entangled with US dollars. And then, in terms of institutional structures, you could have a bank that allows you to convert the Game B currency, or not even the Game B currency, the fiber industry currency, into either another Game B currency or into US dollars, because you are going to have to buy stuff from the outside. And so you eventually see a system that could grow from small to big via producing membranes, which are encapsulated in larger membranes, some of them geographic, some of them purposeful, and the membranes are then connected at various levels via protocols, signaling mechanisms, to allow them to coordinate their work, share materials, share activities in ways that they find mutually agreeable. And if we could actually create that, it would be kind of like the origin of life moment. And again, I think it answers the question, why has none of this stuff worked very well in the past? And I think it's the same answer as how many attempts were there by organic chemistry to produce life before life finally worked. My guess is a very large number. It was a specific set of things that had to come together to make life work. The last universal common ancestor, which all of us, your mushroom in your refrigerator, the starling on the street, and the earthworm are all descendant from Luca, last universal common ancestor, because some magic occurred way back then that produced a sufficiently self-reinforcing and autocatalytic, this is very important, autocatalytic network, which recreated all the elements that it needed to keep itself going. And the theoretical challenge for Game B is to find the smallest possible autocatalytic network of membranes and protocols that can start the thing spinning and can eventually expand until Game B is clearly proven to be better than Game A for lots of people, and a tipping point occurs, and basically we become a Game B civilization. Very modest ambitions there, but that's the essentially the design principle. Fortunately, it's not quite as impossible or quite as insane as it sounds, but it's pretty insane. And that is that there's a fair bit of work in social network theory and agent-based modeling, which shows that systems can tip at surprisingly low points. Systems can tip at somewhere between 3 and 15% is fairly common, particularly, as I would argue, we're in a case now where there's very little allegiance to the status quo.
Yep.
I talk to, I fairly famously I'm neither a team red or a team blue person, right? I talk to both Democrats, Republicans, libertarians, communists, atheists, Catholics, right? I talk to everybody, and I don't find anybody who finds the status quo very satisfying. So in the face of a compelling status quo, I suspect if we can get Game B well established, showing true thriving by the people that are living there in Game B context of one sort or another, 3, 4, 5% may be enough to start a very rapid movement from Game A to Game B. And so that's where my thinking is, and of course millions of details behind that. How do you do that? What are the prerequisites? How do you talk people giving you billions of dollars to do it? All these things, but that's the rough high level picture.
I love it.
Well, there's a lot to work with. There's a lot to work with there, and so many different ideas that we could pursue here. Well, one, I really love your term, which I've picked up a bit, of coherent pluralism. I like the analogy of, instead of trying to create a big tent movement, create a encampment where everybody has their own tent, or all the different groups have their own tent. You have some people who visit different tents to kind of like trade information and insights, but you're not always trying to get up in each other's business, right? If you're kind of a more religiously conservative, or if you're more lefties, you can kind of leave each other alone and cooperate when appropriate. And so I really like that idea. One thing that came up in my mind, and seems like what you're trying to figure out in game B, like I know you kind of are founded on kind of a game theoretical understanding of game A and rivalrous relationships. I know that Daniel Schmachtenberger talks a lot about multipolar traps, right? And so you need, on one level, if you're just one community in one geographic location trying to enact game B principles, you'll probably get devoured by the county over, the civilization that doesn't enact those principles, and comes and invades you or something. And so there needs to be kind of a network that's geographically distributed on the one hand, but at the same time you don't want the top down kind of centralized planning, and so it also needs to be distributed, right? And I know you've talked a lot about like the importance of subsidiarity, nested commons you're talking about. And so the question, I think one of the deepest design questions is, how do you balance those two things, right? How do you have kind of like subsidiarities, minimum viable kind of village structures, while also addressing these multipolar traps and not getting outcompeted by the game A motherfuckers.
Yep, as you said.
say.
Yeah, it's
And so
indeed.
yeah, I guess would you agree that a lot of what you're describing here is trying to figure out, like, it's like threading this needle, right? Where like, how does game B compete, right, and defend themselves, for example, and address these multipolar traps, but also how do they avoid the problems of overscaling, gigantism, right, and have actually the subsidiarity structures, that you need for actual communities and cultures to be cultivated.
Yeah, a very good question. Anyone who claims they have the full answer to that is probably lying, right?
Yeah.
But it's a question we have to work. And I think I'll start with subsidiarity, which you have to understand fully. The statement of subsidiarity is decisions are made at the level appropriate for the problem, essentially. Some people say, oh, that means pushing everything down to, let's say, the proto-B level. No, it's not true. For instance, let's say there were a full game B society with proto-Bs in a bioregion along a river, let's say. The management of the river is not the prerogative of any one proto-B, and no proto-B can dump pollution into the river, assuming that there is a existing membrane that treats the river as the commons, and that everyone that's along that river must agree to the rules of that commons. So there has to be higher level entities, but those entities should not be overcharged. For instance, the river basin membrane should not be dictating what people think about whether to be vegetarians or not, right? For example, because the purpose of that membrane is only to protect the river. It is not a general governance. That is the problem with our systems today, is that we give general governance authorities to these geographic blocks, and they I know in the state of Virginia, so-called Dillon state rule, counties and cities have almost no power except that which is delegated to them by the state legislature, and what power they have can be taken away. And so that's the opposite of a subsidiary society. But you can't go to complete anarchy either. You have to have a carefully constructed hierarchy of membranes with the appropriate but limited authority within that membrane to require and, if necessary, compel adherence to agreements about how we're going to treat the commons that membrane is related to. And of course, that implies that there needs to be a global membrane. We think about things like climate change, or climate change being the one that's most obviously global, but there are some others. But let's use that one because it's relatively simple. Doesn't really matter where you dump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. By physical chemistry, it will change the reflective and thermal retention characteristics of the atmosphere. And so we presume that in a Game B world, we will all agree, and this is probably one of the 3 or 4 founding agreements that is the coherent core, is that we will, each and all of us and at every level, operate within planetary boundaries, safe planetary boundaries. Now, we don't know for sure what that means, and there's still controversy in the science. There's much bigger error bars in a lot of things than both sides like to admit, which annoys the piss out of me. I like people to be honest when they don't know. I've been now calling it the hero's answer. I don't know. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. And I wish more people would. But to the degree we are getting, good knowledge, I think we are decent knowledge on the climate science side, not fully complete yet. We can say roughly what level of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is going to have approximately what long-term effect, and we can commit to, as a outer Game B bubble, to live within that planetary boundary, and that could be binding on the whole world eventually. Well, again, whether you're going to allow public drinking on the street, it's another example I love to use, because how does that impact anybody except the local neighborhood, right? It doesn't. If your neighborhood half a mile away wants to allow public drinking and this neighborhood doesn't want to, why should A be able to impose on B? And yet everything about Game A politics is about coalitions ganging up on people to make other people live the way some subgroup wants them to live, and that's just antithetical to the Game B way of thinking. So this is, I know this is not answers. Okay, what does the governments look like at each level? What is how do you compel? Interestingly, Jordan Hall thinks that perhaps all you need to compel, at least within the Game B context, is the ability to expel. And that perhaps that's all you need. And of course, that's sort of how the foragers did it. Sort of about the 5th level of escalation. If you read Chris Boehm's famous book, Hierarchy in the Forest, which I find to be a very useful book on how people can self-govern, was expulsion. And then the 6th sanction was, well, if the asshole comes back, we'll kill him, right? That could be the way it is. And if the River Valley group, had some notion of control over the ground within the river valley, it could expel a proto-B, say, get the hell out of the river valley, go to some other river valley, see if they'll take you in with your nasty and dirty habits, right? And then, of course, at some level, you need the ability to compel expulsion. And I would say that, at least in general, Game B is not a pacifist movement. Now, war is the stupidest occupation of the human race. There's no doubt about that. And finding a way to end war is important. But there will always be malfactors of various sorts. And game theory tells us that even if we got to a true Game B world, we're always subject to invasion by other strategies. The so-called evolutionary stable strategy of a Game B is not guaranteed to be universally stable against all invaders. So Game B needs to be able to defend itself. And I've often assumed and said so that things like proto-Bs and other on-the-ground Game B entities probably need to have militias. You need to have a trained sense of self-defense, and further, because of the nature of game theory, we need collective self-defense. So if, let's say, a proto-B went bad and elected themselves a Hitler or a Frederick the Great as their leader, and they decide to go start conquering their neighboring proto-Bs, and a Game B way to prevent that is that all the other proto-Bs agree to join in a collective defense and squash those guys and then expel them from the membrane. And so I think it's naive to believe that all this always evolves in a completely peaceful, puppies and flowers kind of way. It may and will in places, and there'll be periods of puppies and flowers, but they're human nature being what it is. There will be conflict, and there will occasionally be violence. And it's best that the violence be enforced from the bottom up, not the top down, and by a collective defense rather than coercion from a higher level entity.
Okay, something I've been thinking about a lot with Doomer Optimism is how much to thread the needle between like self-consciousness or design versus I don't know, just sort of spontaneous co-creation of like vibes. I don't know, with lack of a better word, to basically are Jason and I determining what the culture is? To what extent are we determining those things? And part of my concern is a couple of projects, and I don't want to name names, but a couple of projects that have even been on Doomer Optimism, which were intentionally designed with specific principles in mind, usually by some kind of charismatic leader who's very good at thinking and very good at theory, and saying, basically the tech utopian version of puppies and flowers. We're going to design this perfect system and everybody come join us. A couple of them have crashed and burned, like even since we've had them on, so in a very short amount of time. And it's concerning to me that any kind of design beyond the scale that people can handle, too much change at once. I think when we were talking before about the continuum, it just has such a huge risk factor associated with it. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about that. And one way I've been thinking about it, it's almost like applying the principle of subsidiarity to social norms, which is the make the lowest possible relationships built first, and then you kind of build out from there. So like strengthen and fortify one specific babysitting co-op, and then once that trust and norms have built up and not really designed, more just this is how it works well, this ledger, this is the best system we have, that iterates over time, and then those can kind of connect together. I'm wondering if you're thinking in similar terms with that, because this tension between we have to, like you said, if game B is everything, then it's nothing. So it does have to have some curation, design, or we've got some charismatic leaders who are inspiring some kind of thought of who's in and who's out, that kind of thing. But too much seems disastrous and makes me nervous. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about that tension at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an issue because at one level, leaping forward to something like a proto-B feels very, very attractive, right? Here's a place where we could experiment and again, be very modest and say these are all experiments at this point with ways of living relatively intensely in a game B way. If you're part of a babysitting club, 2% of your life is in game B and 98% of your life is all the usual shit, and how much social change and capacity can really happen at that level? The answer is a little, and more than none, but not a lot. While it's very attractive to think that in a proto-B, we could quite substantially change how we live. We could eat together as a matter of course. We could pool our economics in ways that are not practical out in game A land. We could grow significant amounts of our own food, though I always encourage people not to be absolutist about this. Be practical. Let's take advantage of game A. Let's parasitize game A while
Right.
it's out there, right? And you can do quite a bit more at these higher parts of the stack. However, you're absolutely right. Look at the track record of intentional communities. The survival rate past 5 years is very low. The survival rate after 20 years is about this big, and the most common ones are intense religious communities. And so, while some proto-Bs might be religious, I think the expectation is the majority would probably be secular. So it's a very hard design problem. And my answer to that is I do encourage people to create proto-Bs, but I'm very aware that a significant percentage of them will fail. Oh well. That's how you learn. And the problem is, if you have the Bible, this is how to do a proto-B, and the first two fail, then it's pretty high level proof that that Bible probably isn't so good. But if you have a theory that this is roughly what a proto-B is, there's many ways to proto-B, and someone tries way A and it fails, it doesn't say anything about proto-Bs in general. It just says, don't do that.
Right.
So that would be my approach, is to take the big tent, coherent pluralism, be very careful to make as a cultural norm, nobody's exemplar is the thing itself, right? It is an attempt to do part of the thing in its own idiosyncratic way, and its failures or successes have more to do probably with local details, luck, who would happen to be involved, etc., than it does the broader principles. And so be relaxed about it, that some of them will fail. People are assholes. Oh well, right? And don't consider that necessarily disproving the theory.
I'm really curious about theory of change in the context of some rapid changes that will probably be happening in our world. Biophysical overshoot being one major one. Energy availability, we can get into a whole conversation about energy and whether or not fusion is going to come online and what kind of difference that would make or not. But just our need in general to, or just the recognition that, much of society or much of our status quo that we rely on our life support systems are probably not going to last in the current form. And I'm wondering, in this process of creating these game Bs, developing out this network, how do you see it as being kind of anti-fragile in the sense that, the more shocks there are to the current system, the more successful these experiments can be, or will these be just create more difficulties in creating these structures? Like how do you see the theory of change in relationship to I guess collapse of the current systems?
Yeah, that's always a good question. Will there be a collapse, right? And I think I just finished reading last night Peter Turchin's new book. That he goes through his mathematical modeling of why we're in a very dangerous collapsian period right now, and will be for the next 10 to 15 years, and probably for the next 50. But he's also the first to admit that actual collapses often have idiosyncratic aspects to them, around individual leaders, around exogenous events like pandemics or famines, etc. So at the end of the day, you can't say for sure. But it certainly is part of the portfolio trajectories that we have to take into consideration. But before we talk about sort of game theory and anti-fragility, let's talk a little bit about planetary limits and particularly energy, because it's important to keep in mind that energy is not the only planetary boundary or greenhouse gases, but it is one that is kind of easy to think about. So realize this is a gross simplification. I'm frankly at least as concerned about species extinction, soil depletion, groundwater extraction. There's a whole bunch of ways that we're fucking ourselves up that's not sustainable. But energy is one that's easy to think about, and also it's easy to think about it in terms of things like standard of living. Today, the big offenders on energy per capita, the big that are relatively large countries, are United States, Australia, and Canada. All three of them consume about 11,000 watts continuous power. So the equivalent of 110 100-watt bulbs burning 24 hours a day. That's how much energy our societies are consuming, those three. That's including the embedded energy from our imports, because it looks like our energy consumption is going down a bit in the West. The dirty little secret is basically because all of our industrialization has been pushed off to Asia, or an awful lot of it. The steel, the concrete, the aluminum, all the dirty stuff. When you import it back in, we're up around 11,000. You look at sub-Saharan Africa, most of the countries there are well less than 500, right? So a 20th less. Some of the Southeast Asian countries, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Nepal, etc. Company like India is around 1,000. So again, 1/11th of what the big three. Western Europe and Japan are more like 7,000 or 8,000. Bit less, but still pretty high. And so when you look at what level of non-greenhouse gas energy production could be built by, let's say, 2080 or 2090 without any magic occurring, no fusion, no magical chemistry to pull CO2 out of the air, which
I'm glad you're calling that magic. It is at this point just really magic.
Yeah, I'm not saying it can't happen, but I don't see any proof that it can either, right?
Right.
I mean, something called the second law of thermodynamics makes it goddamn hard, right? And so no magic allowed. Probably, if we're smart and do well, we could get to a point where everybody on Earth, amazingly, which actually means more electricity than we're using now, everybody could have 4,000 watts. Everybody, sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah, actually, interesting. China's right at 4,000 watts now, and so. But an example I use because I think it's more understandable to people in the West is Portugal. Is at about 3,500 watts right now. Portugal is a perfectly reasonable country. I don't know what Uruguay. I don't know what Uruguay is at.
I bet it's similar.
Yeah.
I bet it's similar.
Yeah, and they're not fancy. It's not energy intensive, but it's good life, and so part of our contribution to reaching this level of equilibrium is that I at least believe that one of the few core values is that we have to be transitioning towards realistically about a 4,000 watt society until proven otherwise. If fusion comes online, orbiting solar, deep rock geothermal, those are all possible game changers. In which case, maybe it's 6,000 or 8,000. And that's why I like to talk about metastability rather than stability, because it's stability within the current technological capacity of the human race that's long-term stable. And of course, by itself, that's not enough, because we also have to relinquish our pressure on the other species, stop depleting our topsoil, stop mining our aquifers, etc. But at least on that one, that's the way to do it. Now this is probably where you're getting at. A bunch of early proto-Bs and game B communities and co-housing projects and car sharing clubs can't compel the rest of the world to do anything, right? Nor do we claim to. But what we can do is lead by example. And I would say 20 years ago, this would have been a loser. But when I talk to young people in particular, huge percentages of them understand deep in their guts that the jig is up, that the 11,000 watt lifestyle just ain't going to work, people, particularly perfectly legitimately. Everybody in the third world is demanding the same 11,000 watt life cycle. And if you turn 11,000 watts up today, the whole world would be toast almost immediately. So there is now, unlike 20 years ago or even 10, that change must happen. And so being the example, showing that rather than living in a 2,500 square foot house, living in a 700 square foot house is just fine. Rather than having your own 2.1 cars, being, imagine a proto-B having, a fleet of cars of various sorts, most of them electrical, having our own solar power, wind power, etc., and designing our houses to last for at least 200 years, to be highly energy efficient. And as I said before, the housing should be organized as villages, so it's all walkable. Everything you need within the community at least is walkable. And explicitly design it so that it can be a 4,000 watt way of life that is actually higher in standard of living than the way people live today. And that's the second, I would call, deep pole of Game B design principle. Live within planetary boundaries while increasing human well-being. And this is where Davos man is gone wrong. And if Davos man has his way, it's going to lead to a fascist dictatorship. You can see it all over the world. Just reading in the, I think it was in the Post of the Times this morning, that Marine Le Pen is now, if they had the election for president in France, she'd win right now. Trump, that total asshole, has a chance to win in the United States, right? It was a very close call in Brazil, last time. And what Davos man is telling people is less, right? Guess what? People aren't going to accept less. So the Game B, I think the most current cutting edge version of the Game B story, we didn't focus on this enough early on, is less but more. Less material inputs, but more human well-being, right? How can that be? Well, guess what? If you don't define your well-being in terms of driving around in a fancy Mercedes, it's quite possible. If your human well-being is, having a series of celebrations on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annual basis that are very moving and very warm with the members of your community, having real relationships with real people most of the time, keeping the virtual to a minimum to where it's actually useful, etc. Having a lot of your food be locally grown by people having not getting into arms races about clothing, right? How much time women in particular are spent on clothes and makeup and hair, right? What the fuck? How's that any way to spend your time and your effort, right? And, it reaches its level of absurdity with teenage girls and Instagram. And guess what the result is? Mental health crisis, right? So there are many, many, many things that can be done if we're consciously thinking about organizing how we live to improve human well-being. Again, the struggle of being a young mother in an urban environment, right? Do you put your kids in some commercial daycare? Right? Do you send your kids off to the sausage factory for public education? Right? Wouldn't it be better if your children just ran loose in the community and there are people whose job it is to teach them various things, and there's probably some expert that makes sure that every kid gets exposed to what they need eventually, but not in a rigid doctrinaire kind of fashion. To think about the stresses that would release from families if they didn't have to deal with all that. Of course, there's two ways that people deal with it in Game A. One is they just ignore it and go with the flow. That's most people, right? And then those who actually are starting to become awake agonize about it, right? Because the decisions are almost all horrible or not economically possible. But if daycare were an organic part of the community, if education wasn't an organic part of the community, just as it always has been historically in human times, what does that do to the quality of life, human well-being, particularly for that most important part of society, which are families, young families? And the other, this is not everybody in Game B will agree with this, but I see one of the great failings of Game A right now is it becomes more and more polarized to the isolated single person, right? And less focused on what any civilization that's worth its salt has to be focused on, is providing the best possible context for families, particularly with young children, because that's the future. Duh, right? What kind of an idiot doesn't understand that? But Game A, because it's chasing money on money return, and who has more disposable income? Affluent young singles, right? There's more money to be milked out of them in new and flashy items than it is on, a family with 3 kids who is, doing what they can do to provide a good living for their children. And because we are, dancing to the tune of money on money return, not human well-being, that's what we get. And a game B world would be quite the opposite. And again, this is the Rutt version, not necessarily everybody's version. One of the ways that we will outcompete Game A is be the best place to have children and to raise children. And that people who are tuned to that will see that. And then we will get the highest quality people, because I will also argue that people who are focused on having and raising children are the highest quality people. I'm sure there's plenty of people that will dispute me on that. And I say, fuck you. There's 6 million years of evolutionary history that would say that's got to be true, right?
So it seems like there's 3 different scenarios, roughly. There's kind of the top-down degrowth scenario that the Davos man is kind of promoting. And we see this, there was a recent book called Regenesis by George Monbiot who advocates for a farm-free future where we create all of our food with precision fermentation.
Oh, I read that book. Oh my God.
And
I had Charles Eisenstein on my podcast recently. He's got a few screwy ideas too, but he also had a very vivid way to describe George's and other people's view, which is, yeah, we could probably, do it with high tech and all that, but we'll end up with a world of concrete and shit.
Nice.
Yeah. We recently interviewed Chris Mage, who wrote a counter book to that called "Saying No to a Farm for Your Future." It's a great episode. But so that's one, and I think that's kind of, I guess more of the technocratic, progressive. That's where a lot of heads are getting at. And then there's the other one where we don't do anything, and we have catastrophes. It won't be one big catastrophe. I don't think it'll be several, not equally distributed throughout space and time. And then, we just kind of try and rebuild from that, but that's going to imply a lot of devastation and
suffering.
That's not very ideal either. I mean, already, if you look at some place like Haiti, they're already in a post-collapse scenario, basically. And, that kind of thing might continue to be spreading. And then it seems like what you're describing is kind of like, it's not Papa Bear too hot, Mama Bear too cold. It's kind of like Baby Bear right in between, where it's like, I like this term, this is from the anarchists, the prefiguration, where we're trying to develop the patterns of life at a very small scale and network, these ideas, at a pretty small scale to prepare when, these shocks start probably increasing, right? Exponentially, probably. And how do we respond to those things? We don't want to be completely unprepared. We want to have viable alternatives that can be rapidly scaled out once, all of a sudden the healthcare system of a city just completely collapses, or, food stops showing up at the supermarket. We need to have these alternatives ready to, at a small scale, ready to just be, geared up. But we have to have that ready, right?
Exactly.
So that seems to be kind of like the middle path there, where you're not trying to dictate this top-down scenario. You're not putting your head in the sand, but you're creating viable alternatives, kind of like I know actually you like the dual power, idea or parallel, kind of creating these parallel systems that will really kick into gear once more and more people realize that they're necessary.
Yeah. Oh, well, let me just add briefly. This whole conversation is making me think about defining Doomer Optimism better, and it's just making me think, like, what are our core principles? Because I think up until now we've really just been vibing. Whoever vibes, comes on, and we just see how it goes, whatever. But I also am thinking a lot, as you're talking, Jim, some things that we debate. Homeschooling or schooling in general is a great example that we debate in Doomer Optimism a lot, which is some people say the whole system's screwed, need to keep my kids out of it, I'm going to homeschool, I need to protect them, the system is destroyed. And then other people like Jason and me, we live in a place where the school's basically fine and the kids are not being damaged by it, and we supplement at home with different educational activities. And it's like, how much do you keep your foot in the game A world and being able to navigate it like a normal person? We still do live in a society. We have these ideas like, it would be so great if the kids could run. But then there's like literally neighborhoods in the United States where people call child services on each other if they let their kids like walk down the street by themselves. So it's like, this like tension. We're living in this world that's just like in some places super chaotic. But there isn't, like, maybe, I guess the upshot we take from the schooling debate is just sort of like, there isn't one answer. It'll but depend on your locality,
Absolutely.
The resources you have, how bad is game A, where you are, can you still kind of get along? And then you're kind of like, it's almost like you're in the world, but not of the world. You're like cultivating this alternative within yourself, within your family, kind of hidden at the margins so that it's, ready for its show when the time comes.
Yeah, that's of course a very important conversation to be having. I think I probably would come down into it, perhaps where you guys are. My own daughter to public schools, right? And now later years, when we moved to Santa Fe, the public schools sucked there, so we sent her to a kind of a hippy dippy private school. But there are certainly still places in the United States, though less every year, where I would consider sending kids. And as you say, there are still communities where parenting hasn't gone entirely crazy, but there's a lot of communities where it has. And so you gotta pick your shots. Any given human where they're at has a certain endowment of resources, and they're part of a community or an organization or a network that has capacity X, and they have to make their best use of their capacity. And it may be homeschooling is right, or it may not be. It may be you're better off to focus on co-housing and co-food production, because homeschooling is a huge commitment, particularly if you have to do it at the nuclear family level. And oh, by the way, a lot of parents really aren't temperamentally suited to homeschooling, and this is where my vision, at least, is community schooling is the answer as opposed to homeschooling. So, I think that's not a very crisp answer, but I do think it depends, right?
It seems like community schooling, you can get at it from either direction depending on your context. So if the public schools are really, really bad, you can try and create some kind of, homeschooling cooperative where you're kind of building this community from the ground up. Where I live, I'm in a county with, I'm in a small university county, but I'm in the rural part of it, in the rural district. And from everything I've heard from people I trust, the schools are pretty good. So I'm like, okay, I could invest myself in the school, get on the school board, whatever. And, I could probably approximate this community schooling idea from kind of, the more kind of mainstream way, I guess. And
so it's like
it really depends on where you are.
Yeah, colonizing the already existing institutions,
right,
and nudging them in the Game B direction,
yeah,
or starting from scratch if the institutions are rotten beyond saving.
Though I have heard people who've attempted that nudging the current school system is really hard. The inertia in the system is unbelievable, right?
Yeah. Well, my older kid's going to kindergarten this fall, so I'll report back in a few years how that went.
Well, and I'll just say, I know that's the Uruguay is totally different, but our little rural school and this is how it should be, is so open to parent involvement. I mean, Patrick and I suggested, let's plant some native fruit trees. We went to this little nursery that specializes in native trees, and the person who runs the nursery has all these folk tales about native trees. So he came and planted them. They told these stories, and of course this is Uruguay, so it's totally different. I don't even know if this would exist in the US. It might. Some rural areas, but his daughter comes and plays the violin, and he tells these stories about the ants and this tree and this fruit, and all the kids are playing it together. And that was just Patrick and my initiative. We just thought, oh, let's do this thing. I think it'll be cool. We'll have a little native tree nursery at the school. The kids will take care of, and I think depending on the school and how small it is and how open they are to parental involvement, that it could be cool. It's that would be the ideal model, at least. If the parent comes in and really has an initiative, the school's responsive, and then get some change.
Unfortunately, even in very rural school system where our farm is, we did not live there when our daughter was going to school. We were living in a fairly tony outer suburb of DC. I saw in the paper recently that they're now going to require fingerprinting and background checks on any parent that wants to do anything beyond taking their kid to school, right? So the little man and his daughter with the violin would have to go through fingerprinting and a police background check before that would be allowed. I mean,
what a world.
What the fuck, right? And it's not because anything like that's likely to be a problem where we are, but because it's a state mandate, right? And it's not appropriate to our situation, where everybody knows everybody's business altogether too well, right? Sometimes. Yes. And then exactly. So that's right. What are your local circumstances? But also, what capacity do you have to invest in change, and where can you best do it? And that's a decision everyone's going to have to make for themselves, or in conjunction with other people like themselves. And I think that's the other big change, is trying to do this as isolated individual nuclear families is really tough.
Yep.
A few people can do it, maniacs like us, because we're disagreeable, and don't care what other people think too much. We can do it, but most people can't. So they need networks of mutual aid, mutual support to help make these decisions, and also to create things like, but at least as a potential alternative, homeschool co-op, or even a community school. But it's going to depend a whole lot on the context.
Yeah.
If I lived in California, I would never send my kids to the public schools there. Goddamn brainwashing factories, teaching people just ridiculous horse shit, refusing them to learn advanced math. What the fuck, right?
I know, right. Okay, so while we have you, as we're wrapping up, I'm wondering if you've been following along Doomer Optimism a little bit, so it's kind of cool to see the parallel Game B evolution and Doomer Optimism evolution. Do you have advice for us? The what successes and failures of Game B, and what's the best way to keep going with this? What's the bleeding edge of your thinking in terms of catalyzing movement, managing people? The one thing that we keep coming into, and I don't know if you experience this, is you said at the beginning, nobody owns the copyright to Game B. Nobody owns the copyright to Doomer Optimism, although a few people we have no idea who they are have like taken the name and logo and started selling merchandise. We don't even know who they are. So not that I don't even know if it's anyone's buying it, but then also other people come in and say like, Doomer Optimism is a bunch of lefties, or Doomer Optimism is a bunch of reactionaries. And we're just like, what, everybody wants us to define it. Everybody's like mad because it's relatively pluralistic and open. So anyways, advice for us, and in conjunction with your own thinking about catalyzing more movement in Game B, managing of these bunch of, I don't know, herding cats on a sinking ship kind of thing. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's a bunch of interesting and important questions there. Let me start with I think the easier one, actually, which is, people think you're a bunch of lefties. People think you're a bunch of reactionaries. I go, okay, I don't care. Think whatever you want. This is what we are. And one of the things that Game B has been, I think, very good at is being a big tent. There are Trumpsters, there are communists, there are hippies, there are religious nuts, there are, every kind of, if you project, they're in their Game A manifestation, they're amazingly broad. Now, probably we're skewed a bit center left, I would say, but anybody is welcome so long as they participate in Game B, in the Game B ethos. On the other hand, when on 2 occasions we were invaded by specific quasi-organized factions, one from the left and one from the right, more or less simultaneously, one that wanted to enforce wokery or proto-wokery. It was a little bit before the woke brand was what it was. But if you don't all back this and this, you don't agree to this and this, neo-colonial, what's it, colonial, post-colonial, blah blah blah. And then the other group was quite explicitly racist and anti-Semitic, and somehow thought we were a good recruiting ground. The fathers and mothers of Game B, the Guardians, got together, and it was actually very nice that these 2 things were happening at about the same time. We came through and lopped all their heads off simultaneously.
Expulsion.
23 people bit the dust in one night, and we were totally unapologetic about it. And we explained why, and we at that point posted a set of rules. They're up on the private Game B site if you want to just take a look at them, and you'll see they're not establishing any policy principles about what Game B is, but rather how we'll behave with each other. And totally unapologetic, man. You should have, the firestorm, particularly from the far lefties, was really extreme, right? We just ignored them. Whatever. We don't like you. You don't like us. Don't come around here. Or if you do, we'll chop your heads off, right? And we're even more clear with the anti-Semites and the racists. We did put that as an explicit rule, that we have no toleration for racism or anti-Semitism. But we mean it in the traditional sense, not the value, the meaning-free sense that people use those words today.
Yeah.
and be unapologetic about the big tent nature, and that nobody's going to compel the movement to be something it doesn't want to be.
Mm.
And that's
We've had some similar kind of stuff where we've had to kind of put our foot down and be like, no, one, like Theo is committed to being pluralistic in a specific sense, not necessarily enforcing like diversity quotas or not that, but more like, across communities and solidarity across communities. But we've also had where we had like this gigantic group chat where all these people were contributing, and there was a lot of fighting between the lefties and the reactionaries. And there's, most people are in between somewhere. And it ended up breaking off into, now we have like 3 major group chats, one more the lefty, one more reactionary, one more middle. And so far it's actually working pretty well. I mean, there's a couple of us who are in all 3 to kind of like make sure things aren't going off the rails or anything. But that, so in that sense, it was like we moved from a big tent, whereas like the big tent wasn't working because everyone was fighting, to separate tents in our campground, right? And so that's why
that'd be a very good game B solution, right?
Yeah.
If the lefties don't like to, hang out with the righties, at least about certain things, hopefully they'd eat and drink together. But sometimes that's even getting more difficult. Then let them produce their own membrane, right? Think of the ideas of membranes that are incorporated in other membranes, so long as there is something that they have in common. Right. Can you define what that outer membrane is? I would use that as a design principle, and using subsidiarity, at the higher levels you go, the smaller the coherent core should be for that membrane. So that people can be quite diverse in their submembranes and yet still not violate the common core. That might actually be a fun thing to do with your 3 sub-tribes, to say, all right, are we at 3 sub-tribes of one tribe, or are we 3 different tribes? Let's see if we can agree on what we agree on, even though we disagree on a lot. Is there enough to agree upon for us to be declared or to consider ourselves a tribe or not? And the answer could be either way. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I think we're not close to that. Like I think if you look at either side, they'll be like, nope, not going to work. And I think that's okay for now. Like everyone's just kind of vibing, doing their own thing. Again, like there's a few of us who are like, yeah, there's some kind of meta coherence here, from say my point of view, but from the points of view of the individual groups, not so much, right? And they're just kind of doing their own thing, and for now that's okay, right? They're in cyberspace. They're not trying to share, they're not trying to share a single geographic village or something. Of course that might change in the future.
That would
and I would say the only thing that really draws people to us, and I think this is where I put my foot down, it's so hard to navigate what's going on in the world right now. I feel like the main value we add is just being able to talk to people plainly and non-ideologically about the situations we're facing, the conundra, and then the solutions or the reactions people are having to it. Whatever new thing is coming down the pike, how are you responding with your family, this kind of thing, but also have a sense of humor about it. Don't take yourself so seriously. That's where I really put my foot down. It's like when people are so self-serious and you have to think exactly, you have to respond to this, the world is so chaotic, you have to respond to the chaos in my specific way, and they have like no self-awareness or sense of humor. I just feel like that's everywhere on the internet. Go anywhere else and go be serious with your tribe, and take yourselves super seriously, and all pat each other on the back about having the right point of view. Over here, we're going to talk about difficult things, but we're going to be kind about it. Minimum viable, like a normal human behavior. And people say, oh, you guys kicked me out because because I'm of my ideology. No, we kicked you out because you're unpleasant to be around. We don't want like people who are just miserable and like and constantly insulting people. That's like, the minimum viable thing for me. And I don't know if you kind of share that similar.
Yeah, go take a look at the 10 commandments of the private Game B network. I can't believe how peaceful that network was, or still is. I think I just got a message from it. It's got 3,500 members currently, right? And there has been no shit fights.
Right.
Zero. I mean, I've never seen a community that big that didn't have, fights, but we've been very explicit. If you use obscene language against another member, you will be expelled. No second chance. Personal attacks will not be tolerated. One of the things, I don't know if it's in that list of 10 or not, but another one we enforce on both the Facebook and the private group is no game A politics, no advocacy for candidates, no advocacy for legislation. We can talk about goals, but we can't talk, but no game A politics allowed, period. There's plenty of places on the internet talk about game A politics. We're not talking about game A politics here.
Right.
And I think that has been one of the most powerful de-escalators, right? And so you might consider things of that ilk, though it may not be appropriate for your, kind of lower down on the hill climber aspect where most of people's lives are still going to be in game A. They have to deal with game A. Game B people, well, they're still in game A more than they're in game B. Their heads are more in game B than they are in game A. And so they're willing to, at least when they're in the game B context, not be constantly trying to frame things in game A terms. That's considered a great faux pas in game B land, is to frame a game B issue in game A terms. Go, no, that's not what we're doing here. Don't call us socialist or capitalist or whatever. It's like, those are just old categories. We're creating something new here, and we will borrow from wherever. There'll be elements of capitalism, there'll be elements of socialism, there'll be elements of anarcho-syndicalism, probably more from there than most places. But we're not going to just take some 18th, 19th, or 20th century ideology and worship it. And that is very non-game B. That might be worth an attempt to see if you can seed that idea into Doomer Optimism, that we're just not going to be a place that rubber stamps in fact, one other time we kicked some people out from that very early the earliest resurrection of game B in 2018 for essentially being rubber stamps with some idiotic sub ideology. And we says, if you want to talk and think and debate, great, but just walking around rubber stamping your little slogans, we don't need that. And then when we warned them 2-3 times. When they did it like the 5th time, kicked 6 of them out, boom, done. No rubber stamps, right? Yeah. And so that might be an ethos to put in.
Yeah.
One thing that you've done, Jim, that I've really admired, and I think I want to do more of in Doomer Optimism, is when I've seen a number of people critique Game B or certain founders, and you bring them on, you engage them in conversation. Maybe if they're being too obnoxious, maybe not, but I think there's at least like 3 different examples where there was some like major critique coming at it, and you engaged them, you brought them on, you engaged them on your podcast or the Stoa or wherever. And actually it was a very constructive idea. I mean, one was like the Dark Renaissance people, when they had their critique of Game B, and you engaged them, and that was a great arc.
I love that.
There's a couple others I can think of as well, but I don't have to go down that road. But that's something that I think is really admirable, and something that once we're probably not big enough in Doomer Optimism to get too many like coordinated attacks against us yet. But when we do, to the degree that you can, where people are open to engaging you and not just trying to tear you down, I think that's a very good strategy.
Yeah, I'm glad you recognize that, because that's, again, part of our theory is just as for instance, I'm actually going to be on a 6-way podcast later this afternoon with the Dark Renaissance guys.
Okay.
Oh, really? Go. Okay.
I still get along fine with them, right? And they, they're not afraid to sling punches, but they do it fairly. They're fair fighters, and so I enjoy engaging with them. And I will be playing the counter to 3 of their perspectives around AI mostly. But yeah, so don't be afraid to engage. I actually had probably my worst critic on my podcast one time.
I think I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah.
You don't need to mention names, but yeah.
Don't mention names, but why not, right? I'm confident enough in our ideas that in a head-to-head conversation, you know, I believe that good ideas will prevail.
Right.
And so I'm not afraid of having it out with anybody, as long as they stay engaged in the ideas and not engage in personal attack.
Yeah, in good faith.
In good faith.
Yeah, and I think it's a real Game B type principle too, to integrate, to model civil discussion. This is what we keep saying with Doomer Optimism too. It's not going to be a set thing, but like just being a place where people can have a conversation and model what that's like, you know, what it's like to talk and disagree, but be respectful of one another. I think a lot of times we've integrated a lot of people who might have been enemies by just saying, you know, come on, let's have a conversation. Maybe you belong here too, or at least as an ally. And it's great. It's a great principle and great way to network out.
Or at least not an active enemy.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
We don't wanna, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think I have converted my 2 worst enemies into kind of, okay, I don't like what you're doing, but I'm not going to actively attack you because I kind of understand where you're coming from, and you're not a bad person. You may be an asshole, but you're not actively a bad person, right? Meaning their view of me, right?
Yes, right. Okay, so as we're final question, you know, anything else we haven't covered? What's the bleeding edge of your thinking right now? Anything you really want to get on the record?
And anybody who's interested, how can they plug into Game B?
Yeah.
Probably the best place is our private network. It's much more active than Facebook these days. www, and unfortunately I have to put the www there for weird technical reasons. Game-b.org is probably a good place to connect as any, to find the others, as we say. And you'll find there's people interested in all kinds of different things. And there's like 15 subgroups that do, you know, everything from, there's a women's group, there's a building communities group, there's education group, I think. I don't remember all the groups. There's like 15 of them. And so that's the best place. My podcast, not a bad place. Even though I don't do Game B, I probably only do 15 or 20% of my podcast episodes on explicitly Game B themes. If you pick and choose, you can find some interesting stuff there at jimruttshow.com. Final thoughts. I do think you guys are doing a good job on getting the word out. I would say in some ways you guys are doing a better job than we are at the present time. We're not really highly focused on memetics right now, although we will be again in the not too distant future. So I would say I'm very happy to see you guys out there making ideas that are adjacent and overlapping with Game B more generally available in the world. And also, I think you guys have done a great job, despite your academic pinhead backgrounds, of speaking plain English to regular people, which some of us Game Bers don't always do. Right?
Well, thank you for that. That's very nice. Okay, well, Jim, thanks so much for coming on. This was lovely. I'm glad you finally got to pick your brain, since you've been such a great supporter of ours from early on. And so this is lovely. So we're cheering on each other's mutual thriving, I would say.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, and that's the way I feel about all these other adjacent communities. I have my differences with the meta-modernists or the regenerative ecologists, but they're small. And my agreements are much, much larger than my disagreements. So I think of us all as constellations moving in about the right direction, and we should help each other whenever we can.
Beautiful.
Awesome.
So that's Game B logic across communities, not just within communities.
Exactly. Yep. All righty. Thanks a lot, guys. It was fun.
All right.
Yep.
Have a good one, Jim.
Bye.
Bye-bye.